What happens when brilliant scientists try to create a human soul from nothing? Dr. Alastair Finch thought he'd found the answer in a 200-year-old mystery. But in a hidden room beneath a German library, surrounded by the clinical journals of an impossible experiment, he discovered something that shattered everything he believed about the nature of human consciousness. The boy they called Kaspar Hauser wasn't just isolated from the world. He was reflecting back the deepest secrets of everyone around him. The only light in the office came from the glow of a 4K monitor, its clinical white light painting the sharp angles of Dr. Alastair Finch's face in shades of grey. He was a man who fit his environment, minimalist, precise, and devoid of clutter. His desk was a single slab of polished steel and glass. His bookshelves were curated, not collected. His suit, even at this late hour, was impeccable, but his eyes, reflected in the monitor's screen, were weary. They carried the weight of the horrors he studied with such cool detachment. On that screen was the final report for a case that had dominated the national news for months. Jane Doe, the girl in the basement. A gallery of images documented the discovery. The pale, almost translucent skin, the atrophied muscles, the eyes, most of all the eyes, which were not empty but filled with a kind of profound, pre-human confusion, as if they had never learned the language of sight. She was a girl who had been raised in a single room, deprived of light, sound, and human contact for 18 years. To the media, she was a monstrous victim. To Finch, she was a data set, a living, breathing example of what happens to a mind when it is grown in a vacuum. With a final, decisive click, he closed the file. The screen went black, and the silence of the office rushed in to fill the space. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, the kind that amplifies the sound of your own blood in your ears. For a moment, Finch allowed the mask to slip. The weariness in his eyes deepened into something closer to grief. He had built his reputation on understanding the architecture of broken minds. But sometimes he felt the foundations of his own cracking under the strain. He rose from his chair and moved to the desk, his movements economical and precise. He ignored the stack of peer-reviewed journals and grant proposals. Instead, his fingers went to a heavy, leather-bound book with a faded gold title. The Great Pretenders, A History of Famous Frauds. It was an old volume, a relic from a less enlightened age of psychology, but it was a useful reference for his hobby, historical cold cases. He opened the book, the spine cracking in the quiet room. His fingers, long and elegant, flipped through the pages until they landed on the chapter he was looking for. There, under a faded engraving of a bewildered-looking youth, was the name Kaspar Hauser, the original boy from nowhere, the case that had been a confounding knot of history and folklore for nearly 200 years. To Finch, it was just another puzzle waiting for the right key, and he believed, with the unshakable certainty of a man at the top of his field, that he was the one holding it. The next day, Finch stood at a podium, bathed in the projector's light. The lecture hall was small, the audience a collection of academics who looked as dusty as the archives they curated. Behind him, a slide displayed the two dominant theories of the Kaspar Hauser case. On the left, a romanticized portrait of a German prince, all soft features and noble sorrow. On the right, a cruel 19th century caricature of a slack-jawed peasant, a con man playing the fool. For 2 centuries, Finch began, his voice cutting through the stuffy air with the precision of a scalpel. The debate has been trapped in a false dichotomy. Was Kaspar Hauser, the lost Prince of Baden, a victim of royal intrigue? Or was he a clever imposter, a brilliant fraud who fooled the intellectual elite of an entire nation. He let the question hang in the air before dismissing it with a subtle wave of his hand. The romantic narrative is a fairy tale, gentlemen and ladies. It satisfies our desire for melodrama, but it has no basis in verifiable fact. The cynical alternative that he was a common fraud is, forgive me, intellectually lazy. It is a convenient label we apply to that which we cannot easily categorize. He clicked to the next slide, which showed a list of Kaspar's reported behaviors. His inability to eat anything but bread and water, his violent reactions to new sensory stimuli, his childlike grammar coupled with an uncanny memory. Both theories, Finch continued, his tone hardening with conviction, make the same fundamental error. They ignore the one thing the evidence screams at us across the centuries, the verifiable, profound, and unique psychological trauma of a human mind raised in a void. We are not looking at a prince or a pretender. We are looking at a case study. The result of an unintentional or perhaps intentional experiment in human isolation. A hand shot up from the front row. It belonged to Professor Elke Vogel, a formidable woman in her late 60s, whose entire career was built on the established historical record. "Dr. Finch," she said, her voice dripping with skepticism, "you are a psychologist. We are historians. You see a case study. We see a lack of primary sources, conflicting accounts, and the very real possibility of coaching by his overly enthusiastic patrons. Where is your evidence for this experiment?" Finch gave her a thin, patient smile. It was the smile of a man who knew he was 3 steps ahead. "My evidence, Professor, is in the very accounts you speak of. You call them conflicting. I call them symptomatic. Take, for instance, Hauser's reported hypersensitivity. His violent aversion to color, his ability to smell things from hundreds of feet away. To a 19th century observer, this seems supernatural, or like a parlor trick. To a modern neuroscientist, it is the predictable result of a brain starved of sensory input. When the filters that allow us to function in a complex world are never developed, the brain is overwhelmed. The signal-to-noise ratio is non-existent. It S, not magic. It S pathology. He leaned forward, his voice dropping slightly, drawing the audience in. You look for a signed confession, a letter from a conspirator. I look at the boy's behavior, the accounts of him crying in pain when he first saw a field of brightly colored flowers, his terror at the sound of a church bell, his initial inability to distinguish between a man and a statue. This is not the behavior of a fraud. A fraud mimics normalcy. This is the behavior of a mind that has never constructed a model of reality. He wasn't pretending to be an alien. For all intents and purposes, he was one, stranded on his own planet. Professor Vogel shook her head, unconvinced. This is speculation, Doctor. You are retroactively applying modern theory to a historical phantom. And you, Finch countered, his voice losing its patient edge, are clinging to folklore because it is more comfortable than the alternative. The truth of Kaspar Hauser isn't a romantic story or a simple deception. It is a far more terrifying prospect, that a human being can be unmade, that a soul, if you'll permit the antiquated term, can be raised as a blank slate. He let that final statement settle into the silence, a direct challenge to their entire worldview. He had presented his thesis. Now, all he needed was the proof. That night, the sterile quiet of Finch's office felt different. It was charged with the lingering energy of the debate. He was agitated, pacing the length of his office as he sifted through digital archives on his monitor, pulling up scans of the original Nuremberg city records. Vogel's dismissal had stung him more than he cared to admit. It wasn't enough to be right. He had to be proven right. with evidence so undeniable that even the most stubborn historian would have to concede. An email notification chimed, an incongruous sound in the focused silence. Finch glanced at it, ready to delete what was likely departmental spam. But the sender field was blank, anonymous, and the subject line contained nothing but a string of numbers and letters. A coordinate. Finch froze. His irritation vanished, replaced by a sudden, sharp spike of adrenaline. He opened the email. The body was as stark as the subject line. There was no text, no greeting, no explanation. Just a single, high-resolution image, an attachment that loaded slowly, line by agonizing line. It was a digital photograph of a single, yellowed page from a book or a journal. The paper was foxed with age, the handwriting a spidery, elegant script from another century, written in German. His heart began to beat a little faster. He dragged the image file into a translation program, the software whirring as it performed its analysis. A moment later, English text appeared in a clean, sans serif font next to the Gothic script. The translation was clinical, precise, and utterly chilling. The relocation to Ansbach is complete. The subject's ignorance of the world remains absolute. All prior stimuli have been successfully isolated. We must be cautious in this final stage. The potential for contamination is high. Subject 0 is more valuable than any prince. Finch read the words once, then twice. His breath caught in his throat. Subject 0. The phrase hit him like a physical blow. It was the language of a laboratory, the language of his own world, staring back at him from the past. The confident, authoritative demeanor he had worn at the lecture crumbled away, leaving behind a raw, obsessive curiosity that bordered on hunger. This single, unverified, anonymous piece of data had just bypassed all his rigorous protocols, all his demands for proof and provenance. It was a poison apple, and he had already taken the bite. His theory wasn't speculation anymore. It was real. And someone, somewhere, knew it. The flight from London to Nuremberg was a blur of recycled air and stale coffee. Dr. Alistair Finch barely noticed. His mind was consumed by a single image, a string of numbers on a screen, a coordinate that had pulled him from the sterile comfort of his academic life and thrown him across a continent. Now, under the perpetual grey drizzle of a German sky, the coordinate had become a destination, Ansbach, a town so quaint it felt like a film set, all timber-framed houses and cobblestone streets that glistened under the rain. Finch, a stark figure in a modern black technical jacket, looked utterly out of place, a man from the future walking through a memory. He held his phone in one hand, the glowing blue dot of his location sliding silently through the medieval map. Every tourist a few feet away was taking pictures of the charming facades, of the ancient church steeple that pierced the low-hanging clouds. Finch saw none of it. His gaze was analytical, cold. He was trying to peel back the picturesque surface, to see the town as it was 200 years ago, to imagine the dark secret it held. The coordinate was pulling him away from the town square, away from the light and the life, toward a quiet, forgotten street on the edge of the old city. The blue dot on his screen finally stopped, pulsing over a large, foreboding building. Finch looked up. It was a derelict municipal library, a stone edifice grimed with soot and time, its windows dark and vacant. According to the old city plans he had studied, it stood directly adjacent to the very house where Kaspar Hauser had lived and died. A thick, cloying smell of dust and slow decay met him as he pushed open the heavy oak door. Inside, the library was a mausoleum of forgotten knowledge, Sunlight struggled through the grimy windows, illuminating swirling motes of dust in the cavernous main room. Finch didn't hesitate. He navigated the labyrinth of decaying bookshelves, his footsteps echoing in the silence, following the digital blueprints on his tablet. He was headed for the rear of the building, to a small backroom archive that the plans indicated had once been part of the adjacent property, ceded to the library in the early 20th century. The archive room was cold, a damp chill that seeped into his bones. It was filled with rotting cardboard boxes and stacks of yellowed ledgers. But Finch's attention was on the far wall. According to the 1828 architectural plans on his screen, this room should have been 3 feet longer. There was a section of wall that simply shouldn't be there. He ran his hand along the cold, textured plaster, his breath clouding in the frigid air. It felt solid, ancient, but it was a lie. He balled his fist and knocked once. The sound wasn't the dull thud of stone and brick. It was a flat, hollow boom that vibrated back through his knuckles, a sound that confirmed a hidden space, a secret. He'd come prepared. From his bag, he pulled a slim, powerful crowbar. He found a hairline crack near the floor and wedged the tip in, putting his weight against it. The old plaster groaned, then splintered. With a sharp crack, a section of the false wall broke inward, revealing a pocket of absolute, undisturbed darkness. Finch switched on his phone's flashlight, the beam cutting into the black. He stepped through the breach. The space was no bigger than a closet, the air stale with the scent of enclosed time. The flashlight beam danced around the cramped interior, revealing a small, overturned wooden chair, and on the floor, the faint, tripartite outline of where a tripod once stood. But the most damning feature was on the wall he'd just broken through. Running horizontally at eye level was a long, thin slit, crudely plastered over from this side. It was an observation post, a blind. With a growing sense of dread, Finch used the edge of the crowbar to scrape away the crumbling plaster from the slit. It fell away in dusty chunks, revealing the dark glass of a one-way mirror, its silvering decayed with age. He pressed his face close, peering through the imperfections in the glass. His view was of the room next door, the very room where history recorded Kaspar Hauser had lived. They hadn't just housed him, they hadn't just protected him, they had watched him. Every moment, every breath. He was a specimen in a jar. His heart was now hammering against his ribs, a frantic rhythm against the tomb-like silence of the hidden room. He swept the flashlight beam across the floor one last time, convinced there had to be more. And there was. In the far corner, almost completely hidden in the shadows, he noticed the edge of a floorboard that was slightly raised. He wedged the crowbar beneath it and lifted. The board came up with a reluctant squeal, revealing a cavity beneath. Nestled inside was a heavy, lead-lined chest. It was bound with iron straps and sealed with a complex multi-tumbler lock from the early 19th century. This was it. This was the heart of the secret. Finch knelt, pulling a small leather roll from his jacket pocket. He unrolled it, revealing a set of precise gleaming tools. This was a different kind of archaeology. With the focused calm of a surgeon, he inserted a tension wrench and a pick into the keyhole. For several long minutes, the only sound was the faint, metallic click and scrape of his tools against the lock's ancient mechanism. He felt the tumblers, searching for the shear line, his mind a world away from the dusty room, lost in the pure mechanics of the puzzle. Then, a final satisfying thunk. The lock sprang open. He lifted the heavy lid. The air that escaped from the chest was dry and smelled faintly of leather and acid-free paper. Inside, protected from the damp and the decay, were several journals, at least a dozen of them, bound in dark leather, their pages filled with the same elegant, spidery script from the email attachment. With trembling hands, he lifted the topmost journal. He opened it to the first page. The entry was dated May 26, 1828, the very day Kaspar Hauser first appeared in Nuremberg and later brought to this house. The ink was still a crisp, dark brown on the page, as if it were written yesterday. Finch began to read. The experiment enters its final phase. The subject is installed. We, the inheritors of Locke and the promise of the Enlightenment, will observe the genesis of a soul, ex nihilo. From the raw, untempered clay of a human mind, we will witness the birth of personality, of morality, of God himself. We will create a person from a blank slate. Finch closed his eyes, the leather journal suddenly feeling as heavy as a gravestone in his hands. He leaned back against the cold wall of the secret room, the flashlight beam aimed at the ceiling, casting his face in stark relief. His controversial, career-risking hypothesis hadn't just been right. It was a timid, pathetic understatement of a truth more monstrous and more profound than he had ever dared to imagine. The hotel room had ceased to be a place of rest. It was a nest, a chaotic collage of obsession. The crisp duvet was a landscape of open journals, their leather covers bent back, their spines cracking in protest. Printouts of historical maps and genealogical charts were taped to the walls, connected by a frantic web of red string. An empty bottle of expensive single malt whiskey stood sentinel on the nightstand, a silent testament to the nights spent wrestling with the ghosts of men long dead. For days, Dr. Alistair Finch had been lost in the pages of the journals, and the clinical detachment that had defined his entire career was eroding with every line he read. He was no longer just a researcher, he was a voyeur, staring through time into the prison cell of Subject Zero. His finger, shaking almost imperceptibly, traced over a precise diagram of Kaspar-esque confinement, a small, dark room with no windows, furnished with nothing but a straw mattress and two small, crudely carved wooden horses. He read the lists of meager food, stale bread and water, delivered in the dark. He absorbed the clinical descriptions of the sensory deprivation, the methodical denial of light, sound, color, and human touch. The entries were all penned by the same hand, a lead scientist who signed his name only as the Curator. His prose was as cold and sterile as a laboratory, describing Kaspar not as a boy, not even as a human, but as the subject, the specimen, or simply it. The subject exhibits a placid temperament, one entry read, consistent with a lack of developed ego structures. It sleeps for approximately 15 hours a day and shows no sign of distress, indicating the baseline state of human consciousness is one of dormancy. Finch felt a wave of nausea. This wasn't science. It was torture, documented with the dispassionate precision of a botanist studying a plant. The pride he had initially felt at confirming his theory had curdled into a profound sense of horror. He, a man of science, was now forced to bear witness to the darkest application of his own philosophy, the pursuit of knowledge, not just overriding empathy, but annihilating it completely. He looked haunted, because he was. He was haunted by the ghost of a boy who had been treated like an object, and by the chilling recognition of the scientific arrogance that had put him in that cage. As the days bled into one another, Finch's initial horror began to compete with a new, nagging feeling: confusion. The curator's clinical certainty began to show hairline fractures, tiny anomalies in the data that he was quick to plaster over with jargon. Finch found himself rereading one particular entry over and over. The subject exhibits preternatural calmness in the dark. Its hearing appears exceptionally acute, yet it does not react to our control. Sounds the ringing of a bell, a sharp whistle as expected. It claims to see waking dreams, vivid images that have no external correlate. We dismiss this as confabulation, the brain's natural tendency to create narrative from chaotic neural firing in the absence of stimuli. Finch pushed the journal aside, rubbing his tired eyes. Confabulation. It was a neat, tidy box to put the unexplainable in. He knew the term well. He had used it himself countless times in his own reports. But here, it felt thin, insufficient. He picked up another journal and found a second, even stranger entry. The curator described an evening where, as a test, an observer had stood silently in the corner of the pitch-black room. On the wall behind the observer was a small spidery crack in the plaster, utterly invisible in the darkness. Hours later, after the observer had left, Kaspar was seen tracing its exact outline on the opposite wall with his finger. "We have measured the ambient light," the curator wrote. "It is below the threshold of human retinal activation. The subject could not have seen the crack. Its tracing of the pattern must be attributed to chance. A lucky guess." A lucky guess. Finch felt a chill that had nothing to do with the hotel's air conditioning. The explanation was too easy, too dismissive. It was the kind of rationalization a man makes when he is afraid of his own data. Finch recognized the pattern instantly. It was the sound of a scientist forcing the facts to fit his theory, not the other way around. He was witnessing the very dogma he had fought against his entire career. Only this time it wasn't coming from a stuffy historian, but from the man who held all the answers. That night, sleep was a forgotten country. Finch sat under the single cone of light from his desk lamp, a later journal open before him. The curator's tone had subtly changed. The crisp certainty was still there, but it felt forced, brittle. He was describing an incident that had clearly shaken the other members of his clandestine group. "An astonishing development," the entry began. This evening, the subject, alone in its room, began arranging its two wooden toy horses on the floor. It moved them methodically for nearly an hour. When Observer B finally recorded the final positions, he suffered an episode of acute anxiety and had to be relieved. The subject had arranged the toys into a perfect representation of the Orion constellation. The belt, the sword, the nebula, it was flawless. Finch read on, his mouth dry. "I have personally confirmed that the subject has never been exposed to astronomical charts. It has never seen the night sky. The event is, by any reasonable measure, a statistical impossibility, a fluke arrangement of profound improbability. The other observers are rattled. They speak of it in whispers. I have reminded them that improbable is not the same as impossible. Our feelings are irrelevant. Observation must remain detached." Finch put the journal down. Detached observation. The curator wasn't detached at all. He was struggling to hold his own narrative together. He was a preacher whose God was beginning to whisper blasphemies. Finch could see it with absolute clarity now. The cracks weren't forming in Kaspar's mind. They were forming in the curator's rigid, unyielding logic, and they were threatening to bring the entire experiment crashing down. He reached for the final official journal, the last volume in the chest. His hands felt heavy, his mind reeling from the implications. He read through the last few entries, which were short, curt, and increasingly focused on the logistics of containment. He turned the final brittle page, expecting to find it blank. But as he did, a single folded sheet of paper, tucked into the binding, slipped out and fluttered onto the desk. The handwriting was not the curator's. This was a frantic, spidery scrawl, the letters shaky and panicked. It was a message in a bottle thrown from a sinking ship. Finch unfolded it. "He knows our names," the note began. "Last night, he whispered my brother's name through the wall. My brother Johann, dead 10 years from cholera in Prussia. A name I have not spoken since I left home. The curator found my report on the incident. He burned it. He told me it is mass hysteria, a psychological contagion brought on by our isolation. He says we are projecting our fears onto the boy." The scrawl grew more desperate, the ink bleeding into the paper. "But he is wrong. We did not create a soul. We stripped one bare. We have peeled back the skin of the world and found a raw living nerve. He is not a subject. He is a mirror, and he is showing us everything we are, everything we hide in the darkness of our own minds. This is not psychology. God help us, this is something else." Finch dropped the note as if it were burning hot. The sterile hotel room suddenly felt like a tomb. The scientific mystery he had been so proud to uncover was gone. In its place was a terrifying, sacred horror. The antithesis to his entire worldview had just been presented to him, not as folklore or faith, but as the terrified, first-hand account of a fellow scientist who had stared into the abyss and found something staring back. The experiment hadn't failed. It had succeeded in a way no one could have ever predicted or wanted. It had broken a fundamental law of reality. Dawn broke grey and unwelcoming over Ansbach, but Alistair Finch hadn't noticed the night pass. Sleep was a distant country he no longer had a passport for. The meticulously organised hotel room had vanished, consumed by a new frantic cartography of madness. His methodical workspace was gone, replaced by a desperate, sprawling web of notes and red string connecting page numbers from the journals to single explosive phrases from the panicked letter. He was no longer a researcher. He was a man possessed, caught in the gravity of a truth he could neither accept nor deny. He stared at a grainy printout of Kaspar Hauser's portrait. The boy's eyes, once a subject of clinical curiosity, now seemed to hold an alien intelligence. Finch no longer saw a victim, a fraud, or even a psychological case study. He saw something other, a being forged in silence and darkness, whose senses were not dulled by isolation, but sharpened to a terrifying, impossible edge. With a sense of grim purpose, he began rereading the journals, but the words were different now. The panicked note was his new Rosetta Stone, translating the entire experiment into a language of horror. Every instance the curator had dismissed as confabulation was now a clear echo of telepathic contact. Every coincidence was a terrifying moment of precognition. Kaspar tracing the invisible crack on the wall wasn't a lucky guess, it was clairvoyance. His arrangement of the toy horses into the Orion constellation wasn't a statistical fluke. It was innate knowledge, drawn from a place beyond human experience. The central conflict of Finch's life was now laid bare on the floor of this hotel room. His scientific mind, the very core of his identity, was at war with the evidence he now held in his hands. He was being forced to consider a hypothesis psychic phenomena, the very concept he had spent a brilliant career systematically debunking as the only logical explanation. The irony was a bitter acid in his throat. The sterile environment of the Ansbach town archives was a stark contrast to the chaos of his hotel room. But Finch brought the storm with him. He had changed in the last 48 hours. The arrogant certainty was gone, replaced by a haunted, restless energy that made the young archivist visibly nervous. He moved through the records with a grim efficiency, no longer looking for psychological clues, but for the tangible consequences of the curator's terror. He found it in a dusty, leather-bound ledger labelled Official Inquests, 1833. The entry for Kaspar Hauser was brief. It detailed the discovery of his body in the court garden, a single, fatal stab wound to the chest. The official ruling was vague, listing suicide or an attack by an unknown assailant as equal possibilities. The case was closed with an expediency that to Finch screamed of influence. It was too neat, too convenient. It was the historical equivalent of a contaminated crime scene. He leaned back in his chair, the musty smell of old paper filling his lungs. He now saw the official story of history for what it was. A constructed narrative, edited and approved, designed to present a coherent, comfortable version of the past. It was no different from the Curator's scientific journals, a text whose primary purpose was not to reveal, but to conceal an inconvenient truth. And the truth here was that Kaspar Hauser's death was not a mystery to be solved, but a secret to be exposed. That night, Finch was drawn back to the scene of the crime. Not the court garden where Kaspar had bled to death, but the place where his fate was truly sealed. The hidden observation room. He stood in the cramped, dark space, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the stale air. He was convinced he had missed something. His rational mind told him he had found the journals, the primary evidence, but a new, intuitive voice, the one he had suppressed his entire life, insisted there was more. He ran his hands over every surface, every floorboard, every inch of the cold stone walls. He knelt before the lead-lined chest he had opened just days before. It was empty now, the journals safe in his hotel room. He ran his hand along the smooth wood of the bottom panel, and then he felt it. A slight ridge, almost imperceptible, a seam. Using the tip of a pocket knife, he carefully worked at the hairline crack. With a soft click, the false bottom lifted. Beneath it, lying in a shallow hidden compartment, was one final slim volume. It was not bound in the same sturdy leather as the scientific logs. This one was covered in soft, worn calfskin, a personal diary, the Curator's confession. Finch's blood ran cold. He had found the official record, the one written for posterity. Now he held the secret truth, the one written for no one. Back in the electric glare of his hotel room, Finch opened the diary. The Curator's elegant, controlled script was gone. In its place was a barely legible scrawl, the letters slanted and broken, as if carved into the page by a trembling hand. He turned to the final entry, dated the day before Kaspar was released into the world. "He spoke to me today," Finch read aloud, his own voice a hoarse whisper. "Not with his mouth. He spoke to me through the plaster and the wood. He did not shout, he whispered. He whispered the name Annalise." Finch's breath hitched. He frantically searched the other journals. The name appeared nowhere else. "My daughter," the diary continued, the words blurring on the page. "My beautiful Annalise, taken by fever before her 3rd birthday. A name I have not spoken aloud in 20 years. A grief I thought was mine alone. This creature is not a blank slate. It is an echo, a void that reflects back everything we hide in the dark. It is an abomination, a perversion of the natural order. I have seen the future in its vacant eyes, a world unmade by this silent knowledge. I have given the order. The experiment must be terminated. The echo must be silenced." Finch dropped the diary onto the cluttered floor. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place, and the image it formed was one of unimaginable terror and sorrow. The Curator, the man of pure, enlightened reason, had been confronted with an irrefutable, supernatural truth, and he had reacted not with scientific inquiry, but with the superstitious terror of a medieval peasant. He had set out to prove the soul didn't exist, and in the process had found something so powerful it broke his mind. Finch finally understood. Kaspar wasn't killed because he was a prince, a threat to a line of succession. He was assassinated because he was a prophet, a threat to the very nature of reality. Weeks later, Dr. Alistair Finch stood at the same podium, in the same university lecture hall, but the room was transformed. The handful of dusty academics from his first presentation had been replaced by a standing room-only crowd. Reporters with cameras lined the walls, their lenses like 100 unblinking eyes. Every important figure in European historical and psychological circles was there, drawn by the explosive rumours that had leaked from Ansbach. In the front row, Professor Elke Vogel sat with her arms crossed, her expression a mask of undisguised hostility. She was here to witness a public execution, and she intended for it to be Finch-esque. But the man at the podium was not the same man she had confronted weeks ago. The sharp, dismissive arrogance was gone. In its place was a somber, humble gravity. His voice, when he began to speak, was quiet, but it commanded the attention of the entire room. "We begin with the evidence," he said, his tone measured and methodical. Not with theory, not with speculation, but with the tangible, verifiable facts of the case. For the next 20 minutes, he did just that. He built a wall of pure, unassailable science. He showed them high-resolution photographs of the hidden observation room, its dimensions, the materials used to conceal it. He displayed the digital scans of the official journals, running a linguistic analysis that proved they were written by a single author over a consistent period. He presented a meticulous psychological profile of Kaspar Hauser, cross-referencing the historical accounts of his behavior with modern case studies of sensory deprivation and institutional trauma. He was wielding the tools of his trade with the careful precision of a man laying out the evidence for a murder, brick by methodical brick. He was building a case so logical, so rational, that even Professor Vogel could do nothing but listen in tense silence. Then, reaching the crux of his argument, Finch paused. He took a sip of water, letting the silence in the room deepen. On the large screen behind him, he projected the image of the panicked, anonymous letter he had found tucked into the final journal. "The official record of this experiment," Finch said, his voice dropping slightly, "is, however, incomplete. The dataset is flawed, because the men conducting this monstrous experiment began to observe phenomena for which they had no category." He clicked to the next slide. It was a list of the anomalies, the inexplicable knowledge of the Orion constellation, the ability to see and trace objects in near total darkness. A low murmur rippled through the academic side of the audience. This was not the dry, factual analysis they had been expecting. This was something else. Professor Vogel seized the opening. She stood up, her voice ringing with indignation. "Dr. Finch, this is baseless conjecture. You lure us in with a facade of scientific rigor, and then you pivot to this ghost story. You are abandoning science for cheap sensationalism." The reporters' cameras flashed, capturing the confrontation. Vogel's accusation hung in the air, a direct challenge. The old Finch would have met her anger with dismissive wit, cutting her down with a sharp rebuttal. The new Finch simply looked at her, and for the first time, his eyes held not condescension, but a kind of weary empathy. "With respect, Professor," he said, his voice calm and steady amidst the brewing storm. "The most unscientific thing we can do is ignore data simply because we cannot explain it. To do so is not rigor, it is dogma." He turned back to the screen and clicked to his final slide. It was a high-resolution scan of the last, terrifying entry from the curator's private diary. The shaky, broken handwriting filled the screen. Magnified in the center of the image were 2 words. He whispered the name Annalise. A hush fell over the room. Finch let the image hang there for a moment before he read the entire passage aloud, his voice imbuing the curator's terrified words with a profound sadness. He read of the dead daughter, the grief known to no one, and the final, chilling order to silence the echo. When he was finished, he looked out at the sea of stunned faces. The experiment to create a human soul in a vacuum failed, Finch said, his voice resonating with a newfound authority. But in its failure, it may have inadvertently proven that the soul, or consciousness, or whatever name our science will one day give it, was there all along. Not as a product of culture or learning, not as a ghost in the machine, but as the machine itself, as something fundamental. And for a brief, terrifying moment, a group of scientists in a dark room in Germany came face to face with a truth for which they had no name, and it broke them. He did not need to say anything more. He had presented the crime, the evidence, and now the motive. A motive born not of reason, but of a terror as old as humanity itself. Later, Finch walked alone across the university campus, the autumn leaves crunching under his feet. The press conference he had left behind was still in a state of chaos, a storm of questions and arguments he had no desire to engage with. He could hear the faint sound of reporters shouting his name, but he ignored them. He looked up at the vast, indifferent sky, his face thoughtful. He was no longer the man of absolute certainty who had started this journey. The world, which he had once seen as a complex but ultimately solvable puzzle, was now once again infinitely complex, deeply mysterious, and all the more beautiful for it. He had set out to prove a theory, to debunk a myth, and replace it with a clean, scientific explanation. He had failed. He had not debunked a myth. He had unearthed a truth far stranger, far more terrifying, and far more profound. And he knew, with a certainty that ran deeper than any science, that he would carry the weight and the wonder of it for the rest of his days. What is so compelling about the story we've just heard isn't just the terrifying explanation for Kaspar Hauser, but the journey of Dr. Finch himself. He begins as a man of absolute certainty, aiming to replace the messy folklore of a lost prince with a clean, clinical diagnosis. His goal, and the goal of the original experimenters, was to prove that even the human soul could be observed, measured, and understood by science. But the great irony of the story is that the man of pure reason, the curator, is the one who ultimately breaks. When faced with an event that defies his framework, the whisper of his dead daughter's name, he doesn't recalibrate his theory. He abandons science entirely and reacts with superstitious terror, branding Kaspar an abomination that must be silenced. In his attempt to kill a myth, the scientist becomes the monster from an old story, a man haunted by a ghost of his own making. Dr. Finch, in the end, chooses a different path. He doesn't label the phenomenon supernatural. He simply presents the inexplicable data and accepts the profound mystery. He shows us that perhaps the greatest sign of intelligence isn't having all the answers, but knowing how to live with the questions. This brings up a fascinating dilemma for all of us. When a man of science is confronted by an event that shatters his worldview, he reacts with fear. So what do you think is the real difference between an anomaly science can't yet explain and the whisper of a ghost in the machine?